I'm curious what the additions were that law enforcement and judges wanted to add to the bills to, so that the dogs would be okay with it.
Well, the dogs are not going to be okay. They wanted to, and I think that this is actually going to be part of what the federal farm bill allows for states to do as well. They wanted those folks to be who are hauling hemp through the state to get a permit to haul through the state, and that's not unusual right now. If you have an oversized load or an over-length load, you have to get a permit. And I spoke to the Idaho Department of Transportation. They're actually getting a new computer system that's going online in July that they thought it would be very easy for them to do that. People could go online and do it. I said, after our fiasco with the driver's licenses, I said, I hope you test it first. Anyway, so they wanted to make sure that there was a permit, that people called in advance and said we're coming through, so that law enforcement knew they were coming. They would have to stop at a port of entry or at a regulated stop, which we already have set up. It's already set up in code. So it wasn't anything really that they were easy, common sense solutions, just so that they were aware that the product was coming through the state and that they would have heads up. And quite frankly, it's protection for those folks hauling through, so that they wouldn't be considered to be trafficking. So that was one. We negotiated through a whole bunch of different ideas. I learned all sorts of new law terms. I'm very fortunate during the session. My landlady's retired from the Idaho Court of Appeals, so I would say, what do you think of this, Karen? And she's like, oh no, you don't want to do that. So she helped give some really good guidelines from kind of a more court-based perspective that was very helpful. I just think that they wanted some clarity, and it's a new world. And it's if you're in law enforcement and you've been working really hard to make sure that illegal substances don't come through the state, it's a pretty big step for them. And so I think what they wanted was reasonable, and I'm sorry we didn't get that through for them, because more than anybody, they're hanging out there without any guidance on how this is going to go into effect, and the federal government is saying they're going to have their regulations in place early fall, in September, October, and then commerce is going to have to take place, and under Idaho law, those truckloads are going to be illegal. So if they come through the state and they get caught by state police or the sheriffs coming through, and it's hemp, under Idaho law, it's illegal, just like the last loads that came through in January. We're going to be hit with a whole bunch of civil lawsuits because we're going to be breaking all sorts of commerce clauses. And I feel particularly sad that didn't happen, that we didn't take care of that. Thanks for the question. Nancy, you had a question?
Right, we've heard tonight that you're anticipating having to look for different sources of funding for Idaho's share for the cost of Medicaid expansion. Representative Nelson-Troy, you mentioned that you've requested kind of a deep dive research on the local implications or the county level implications of or repercussions of legislative action, and I'm wondering if you've specified that would include looking at county indigent funds as possible funding sources, as we've heard might be considered next session.
And there's an interim committee that's going to be looking at that, and that is definitely going to be a part of how this gets funded, because that was one of the arguments that was set forth on Proposition 2, is that these, we'll be saving all these monies, and that those monies were included. And so I would not be a bit surprised if somehow those funds were included to help cover the expansion costs.
I have my letter mentally written about why that's not a good idea. I'll share it next session.
Yeah, send it to the interim committee. But we've got to fund it somehow, and if it comes out of the general fund, then that's money that's not going into education. And it's my understanding in the Idaho Constitution that counties are responsible for indigent care. And so how do counties if this is partially indigent care, how does that play out? I'm not on that committee, so it'll be an interesting committee to see how that works.
Bill, I want to thank you for taking that bill, what did you call it, the school violence?
The school safety.
School safety. Law enforcement in Moscow, and I suspect all around the state, they work really hard to try and protect our children. And I know that the Moscow Police Department was very excited that that bill passed. And they have that ability to arrest someone without, having actually heard him or her say the violent act that they were going to do. And everybody, every parent and grandparent and everybody who believes in our children should be happy that that bill has passed, because that is really helpful for protecting your children. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So I have a question about food tax, grocery tax. And it went up to Otter and it didn't go anywhere. But Little has said that he's in support of taking that away. Is there any movement on that for next session?
Will you repeat the question? Yeah.
Yeah, the question was with respect to the viability of the grocery tax.
Right.
And I think what happened was, again, with what Senator said, because of the withholding deficit that we had, that just died right away. We could approach another tax cut with already questions with respect to revenue coming in, and that started out very early on, and it was put to rest real quick. Now next session, that may be a different story, but I think one of the challenges I would say is defining what food is. And that's going to be another one of those interesting discussions.
So everything Bill said, the governor didn't even ask for it at the beginning because the budget was too tight. I guess two things. I'd like to remind everyone that we have a refundable tax credit on food already, and I consider removing the tax from food actually a little bit regressive, because since if you're low income, that refundable tax credit, you don't even have to file taxes, really covers up $5,000 or $6,000 of food purchases for a family of four. So want that on it. But the other piece that might come together next year on it, if you're in favor, is we fix the sales tax on internet sales this year, something called the Wayfair decision. So that's bringing money in. I thought the bill we did is a little crazy because it puts all that money into a fund to cut taxes. So maybe we'll cut the food tax with that money, but we're collecting the internet tax to cut taxes somewhere else.
That's transportation infrastructure with Highway 16 or something like that.
No, the Wayfair bill just stuffs that money into a fund.
So, I'm sorry, I just have to say this quickly, it's just a complaint. But I've heard you guys say many times now how short Idaho is on funds and how you're having to play with the budget and move things around to be able to fund the things we want to fund. And then the legislature passed through these sideboards that on the Medicaid expansion that cost, the last thing I saw was 1.4 million maybe to administer these work requirements. And maybe that figure's not quite right, but it doesn't make sense to me why there was so much of a focus on that in the legislature and wanting to spend that money when we're so short on spending money for things that are maybe, to me at least, more important.
Well, what you have to realize is there's 105 legislators and they all have 105 different ideas. And the 3 legislators you have in front of you didn't vote for it.
I know you did, and I appreciate that. But it just boggles my mind.
There are about $2 billion worth of sales tax exemptions in this state. Do you think there's any time in the foreseeable future when the legislature is going to take a serious look at removing some of those, changing some of those at some point to increase some revenue stream?
Well, I wish to goodness we would. I mean, I think it's very short-sighted of us. And I think even beyond looking at all the exemptions that are in place, we should be treating the income side of our budget with the same care that we're treating the expenditure side. And so the Joint Finance and Appropriation Committees, they do tours on the off-season. We spend an incredible amount of time. I spent a term, 2 years on the Revenue and Taxation Committee, and there's no deep dives into these decisions that we're making. And, we need to look at the holistic thing, but then we should also commit ongoing to be looking at this income side of things. I can remember my daughter calling home one time and telling my husband that, all the things that she'd cut out of her budget. And Dave said, Molly, you don't have a spending problem, you have an income problem. And, we gotta take care of the income problem just as much as we have to take care of the spending problem, and we're not. Maybe this is the governor under which that'll take place, because he really does like policy and understands the importance of all policies to the state health. That's a great question.
I can give you one example, and I'm working on it right now. If you were to, if one of us was to receive a traffic ticket here in Moscow, written by a Moscow police officer, 90% of that cost of that ticket stays in Moscow. If it's written by the sheriff, he'll be lucky if he gets $7. That makes sense. And so it goes all the way back to 1905. And I was trying to figure out who was speeding in 1905. Right? Somebody was horse and buggy past another horse and buggy. But even then, the money went to the local school district. All the way up to 1971, it went to the local school district. All of a sudden now, it goes to the State Department of Education. And that's not right. That means, especially when you look at the sheriff who needs a dog, or needs this, or needs that. So those are things that I'm working on right now. And it's a fun dive into what history is all about in the state with respect to those kinds of things. But there should be no difference. If it's the same ticket issued by 2 different departments, it should stay there. So those are kinds of things that I was really impressed working with the Supreme Court, and I got one of those little thank you notes from them. I carried several bills for them to take a look at how we treat minimum sentencing, and giving some flexibility there for judges to offer alternative sources. We did one with DUI, a DUI diversion, where an individual that's caught with a DUI can go through a diversion program at his or her cost. So those are some of the things that are being worked on. So it's just diving in and digging deep. And I've got another one going on, is the number of contracts that are sole sourced by a particular agency. That's not right. It needs to be competitive sourced. So, looking at that and trying to figure out